Brazil's far-right former President Jair Bolsonaro and some of his closest aides were targeted by a federal police operation on Thursday regarding a planned 2022 attempt to lodge a coup in Brazil. It's another whirlwind day in Brazilian politics, and this is another live broadcast from Brazil this week. Good evening, my name's Euan Marshall, Deputy Editor of the Brazilian Report, and this is another edition of Brazil This Week, breaking down a hectic day of news in Brazil as the federal police appears to be closing in on former President Jair Bolsonaro and many of his high-ranking allies and aides. And today I'll be joined by our Brasília correspondent, Cedê Silva, to break down all of today's developments. But first, before we get into it, if you like our work, please subscribe to the Brazilian Report, which is the engine behind these lives and our Explaining Brazil podcast. We're an independent media outlet covering Brazil and Latin America, and we're based on subscribers only. So, please do check us out, and you can check out our membership page to see exactly which kind of subscription fits your needs. We've got a lot of different levels there, newsletters, website content, all that sort of stuff. And also, if you aren't ready to subscribe now, you can always send us a coffee on Buy Me a Coffee, and that's at buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report. Okay, so Cedê Silva, Brasília correspondent for the Brazilian Report. Welcome. How are you doing?
I'm fine, Euan. Thank you for having me.
And Cedê, they say that the year in Brazil doesn't usually start until the end of Carnival, but I mean, we're here at the start of February. Carnival's still a couple of days away, and 2024 is starting big. Former President Bolsonaro has been targeted by a major federal police operation. So take us through the headlines from today's events, if you will.
Yeah, so indeed, the federal police have avoided the rule that in Brazil the year only starts after Carnival. The federal police conducted this Thursday a major operation, which is very important for two things. First, it is the first operation where the federal police is providing or identifying a direct link between former President Jair Bolsonaro and the planned coup attempt that began in late 2022 and culminated in the January 8 riots in early 2023. And the second thing, the second reason for why this federal police operation is important is because it is the first to weave together the several threads in previous investigations of activities in the Jair Bolsonaro administration. So we have heard before, for example, of the so-called parallel intelligence service. And we have heard before of the attempt to discredit the election system, an attempt by hackers to discredit Brazil's voting machines. And we have heard before of the involvement of the top brass of the military and people in Bolsonaro's liberal party. But now, for the first time, the federal police has identified these different groups, which the police calls cores, and they have shown that the cores have worked together in this coup attempt.
Okay, and so, I mean, today we had, I believe it was 33 different search and seizure operations. So beyond Jair Bolsonaro being involved in this, who else are we talking about here? Who are these key allies? Who are these close aides that we're talking about?
Yeah, so this operation is also important because it is the first to go after really big fish. Some of them were identified in the select panel last year of the congressional panel on the January 8 riots. So last year, both the House and Senate, they had a committee to investigate the January 8 riots, similar to what happened in the United States with a legislative committee to investigate the January 6 riots. And the final report of last year's committee suggested the indictment or the investigation of 61 people, including Jair Bolsonaro himself, and also some key top military people of the Bolsonaro administration, and some of his closest advisors. And they are amongst the people that the federal police raided their addresses today, and a few of them were even arrested. So we are talking about, for example, former army generals such as Augusto Heleno, who was the de facto top head of Brazil's intelligence service during all of the Bolsonaro administration, because he was the minister during all the 4 years. And we are talking also about former international advisor Felipe Martins, who was actually arrested, according to the federal police, because he entered the United States when Jair Bolsonaro left for Florida in late 2022, but there is no registration on the migration authorities on him leaving the United States. So he was arrested here in Brazil, but the police couldn't find a document saying that he left the United States, which made the feds suspect that he was trying to avoid law enforcement. And so he was arrested because of that reason, because they couldn't find him with a document saying that he had left the United States.
Mm. And so obviously Jair Bolsonaro himself is not being arrested, but he had his passport seized, or he was told to hand in his passport within 24 hours. He's done that, hasn't he?
Yeah, so Mr. Bolsonaro was ordered to turn in his passport. According to his main spokesman, Fabio Van Garten, his passport was actually here in Brasília at the headquarters of the Liberal Party, and this passport has already been handed to authorities. This is an important measure, some are speculating, because usually in several occasions, the federal police or judge, they will order you to hand in your passport before they are ready to arrest you. So it has led to speculations that the authorities and officials are preparing a possible arrest warrant for former Bolsonaro, since he was just ordered to turn in his passport.
I think one of the things you were saying there earlier, Cedê, which is really interesting, is that how this investigation, this operation, is probably the first time that we've seen a lot of these things kind of tied or threaded together. One of the most interesting and potentially most kind of scandalous bits of news that came out last year was the story of this draft decree found at the house of Anderson Torres, who was Bolsonaro's justice minister for a period. And today, this kind of operation, this investigation has shed some fascinating new light on that particular story. If you could just kind of fill us in on that, like where are we with this draft decree issue?
Sure. So for a foreign audience, this is very similar to January 6th in the United States. So we had a very similar plot here in Brazil, with the main difference being that, unlike in the United States, where Donald Trump was in the capital during the January 6th riots, in the case of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro had left Brazil and he was in the United States during the riots. So the investigations have been shedding light on what Bolsonaro was doing just before he left Brazil, before Lula's inauguration, and what took place in the week leading up to the January 8th riots. So Anderson Torres served as Bolsonaro's justice minister up until late in his administration. And Anderson Torres was also in Florida during the January 8th riots, where Bolsonaro also was. Federal police had a warrant to arrest Anderson Torres while he was in Florida, and he returned to Brazil, and he was arrested, and he spent a few months in jail. During the same operation where federal police tried to arrest Anderson Torres and could not immediately do so because he was in Florida, they went to his home here in Brasília, and they found a draft decree that in Brazil is known as the draft putschist decree, or the decree of the coup. And this coup decree, which was not published at the time, had several provisions that basically would mean that the executive power would take over the electoral court. They would have power to arrest people, and they would have the power to overturn the elections. And we knew already that this decree was discussed late 2022, after the election was over, but before Lula took office. Very similar to January 6th in the United States, where we have this coup attempts about the Electoral College and about overturning the election and about trying to find votes in different states and calling secretaries of state in Georgia and so on to try to overturn the election after the election was over, but before Biden could take office. So very similar stories. So when the police found early last year, the draft decree at the home of former Justice Minister Anderson Torres, there was no direct evidence that Jair Bolsonaro had seen that draft. And a few months later, in an event, Jair Bolsonaro even said that he had never seen that decree, and he even said in a sentence that coups are made with rifles, not with paper. And so he denied having any evidence or any knowledge of that decree. What the federal police is saying this Thursday is that a similar decree was discussed by Bolsonaro himself at the presidential residence, and that they have evidence that this was discussed. This draft decree was presented to Bolsonaro at the presidential residence in late 2022, and even Bolsonaro suggested modifications to the text. He suggested changes, which is the federal police saying that he was very aware of the text, because otherwise he could not propose or request changes to the text. And this would include, this text would include the arrest of some authorities, including Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, who is Bolsonaro's main enemy, and also the judge who authorized today's operation. In my understanding, and this is not in our story in the Brazilian report, it wouldn't be necessary for the draft purchase decree to have Alexandre de Moraes' name on the list, because the draft that is already public and was found at the home of Anderson Torres already included the possibility of arresting people without their names, but it already included that possibility. But what the federal police is saying today is that they have evidence that a different version of that decree specifically included the arrest of Justice Alexandre de Moraes, and Bolsonaro was in favor of keeping that name on that decree.
And just as you mentioned there, obviously your story on the Brazilian report, which we published this afternoon, Thursday afternoon. So I do urge people to go and check that out there on Brazilian.report. Yeah, excellent write up there. There's lots of information and a lot more detail than we can go into in a kind of a 15-minute live broadcast. And Cedê, from what you were mentioning at the start of this broadcast, is that the federal police had kind of singled out these 6 groups, these 6 corps, as they called them, as part of this kind of anti-democratic effort. What are these corps? Is there any kind of new information there? Are there new people involved that we haven't seen before? What are these 6 corps?
Yeah, so there are not really new names or new information on this, because the main names, such as Lieutenant Colonel Mauro Cid, Augusto Heleno, Braga Neto, etc., these generals, these people higher up in the Bolsonaro administration, we already knew about these things. We already had suspicion about their activities, because a lot of them were public to begin with. A lot of these courses were very public, and also because last year the January 8th panel in Congress had already suggested the indictment of many of these people. So there isn't a lot of new information on the names on the people that did these things. The new thing is that the federal police is finally going after them. Is that the federal police is raiding their addresses, going after their mobile phones, and so on. And so we will have new information soon based on what the federal police is going after. So the new thing is not the names, but the fact that the feds are finally going after these people. The group, as you said, oversaw a lot of different activities, but the new thing is that the federal police has finally weaved them together in identifying that the different activities of the military campsites, the disinformation about voting machines, the parallel intelligence service, they all were working together towards the same objective, which was in preparing this coup plot attempt and in getting a simulacrum, at least, of political support for this coup.
And do we have any idea where these kind of revelations came from? I mean, you mentioned the Lieutenant Colonel Mauro Cid there. He entered into a plea bargain at some point last year. Was that part of it? Was that was he used? Was his information used in today's operation?
Yeah, definitely. The plea bargain by Lieutenant Colonel Mauro Cid, who worked as aide-de-camp to Bolsonaro. So he was Bolsonaro's closest advisor, not with a ministry position, not with a cabinet position. So he was a very personal advisor, and he used to run errands for Bolsonaro, including going to the bank and paying a small expenses, paying small bills. So his plea bargain was definitely very important. Some things are not specified by the federal police where they obtained, but they have, for example, phone messages, presumably WhatsApp messages, exchanged between several military officials or close advisors. And so they know from these conversations among top-level Bolsonaro officials what they were discussing and what things they were aware of, and that they were aware of preparing a decree that would authorize, quote unquote, authorize an effort to overturn the election, and that they were trying to get political support among different groups of Brazilian society that they needed in order to make this coup easier. First, they needed, of course, support among most of the armed forces themselves. They also needed support from the population, and this is why they tried to discredit the electoral system with plenty of disinformation about the voting machines. And they also had the political wing, which included, for example, the petition by Bolsonaro's Liberal Party on late 2022 to try to nullify dozens of millions of votes based on the conspiracy theory that the older voting machines were not properly audible. And so they could only count the new voting machines. And later, a story by our colleagues here at the Brazilian Report showed that, in fact, the opposite was true, and that the electoral authorities, electoral officials despised by Bolsonaro and their allies, they in fact worked very hard, including with US officials and people in foreign companies, in order to get the new voting machines, which are the machines that the conspiracy theorists say that are the proper, adequate machines.
Yeah, no, I mean, fascinating stuff. And obviously, the situation for Jair Bolsonaro now, he has already been made ineligible for public office until 2030. And as you suggested earlier, there is a possibility that if you have to hand in your passport to the federal police, you might be getting another visit by federal marshals someday soon. What does this mean then for the kind of the macro of Brazilian politics? I mean, we already knew that Bolsonaro was not going to be technically in the game for the next presidential election, but it's one thing him being ineligible, it's another thing him being potentially in jail.
Well, politically, in my understanding, the sad part is that this does not change anything. That much similar to what's happening in the United States, the very public facts of the previous government trying to overturn the election and trying to have a coup in Brazil does not, unfortunately, bear a lot of political weight, because you still have a polarized system and you still have a lot of politicians that will not accept the facts, will not accept the investigations, and will instead side with Bolsonaro in saying that this is political persecution and so on and so forth. So what you have is you have the main right-wing party, just like in the United States, saying that this is persecution and that the Bolsonaro is still their leader and that there was no coup attempt and it's all fake news by the left and so on and so forth.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, well, we will definitely be keeping up with all the major developments on this story over the next days and weeks and months. And Cedê in Brasília, you'll be well positioned to cover that for us. And thanks a lot for your story today, and thanks a lot for joining us on Brazil This Week.
Thank you, Euan. See you next time.
And just to people watching, if you enjoyed that live, please do check out the Brazilian Report, which is the journalistic engine behind this live, behind our Explaining Brazil podcast as well. We're an independent media outlet focusing on Brazil and Latin America, and we rely on your subscriptions to keep us going and to fuel our journalism. So if you liked this live, if you liked Cedê's story, which you can see on your screen just now, please do consider subscribing to the Brazilian Report at brazilian.report/subscribe. That's brazilian.report/subscribe. And we've got a bunch of different subscription levels that can fit your needs. We also have daily newsletter services, which are award-winning, actually, in fact. So please do check that out. And if you're not ready to support us by subscribing to the Brazilian Report today, or if you're already subscribed and you're looking to give us a little bit of extra support, you can check out our Buy Me a Coffee page, which is buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report. And you can donate us coffees there to support our work. And all of that is really well appreciated by me and everyone on the team at the Brazilian Report. So thanks a lot for everyone who has already supported us, and for the people who will support us in the future. And I think that's all for today on Brazil This Week. As we said, if there's any major developments, we'll be back in front of the camera speaking to you. Anything to do with Bolsonaro and the federal police. But until then, have a great day, and we will see you next time. Thank you very much.